The end of World War II marked the cessation of global conflict, but it also heralded a vast and complex logistical dilemma for the Allied powers. As the last shots were fired, and the war that had consumed decades of lives, resources, and territories finally came to a close, the question of what to do with the massive stockpiles of ammunition amassed by the victorious nations became a pressing issue. The Allied stockpiles, comprising artillery shells, bullets, bombs, rockets, and grenades, represented a staggering quantity of ordnance that no longer had a military purpose, and their disposal would shape the post-war landscape in ways both seen and unseen. The scale of this problem was immense. By 1945, the Allies had produced an estimated 40 million tons of ammunition throughout the war, with vast quantities remaining in storage at the war's conclusion. The sheer volume created an unprecedented challenge in terms of both economic cost and logistical strain. Initially, the stockpiles were seen as an asset. They were the final bulwark of a war economy that had been designed for mass production, but with peace now settled over the European and Pacific theaters, these vast caches of weaponry no longer had any clear use. Much of the ammunition was produced at specialized facilities, often on an industrial scale, designed to meet wartime demand. With the end of hostilities, these factories found themselves either repurposed or shuttered, and the steady demand for ordnance ceased. Yet, while the fighting ended, the stockpiles did not vanish. Across both Europe and the Pacific, ammunition storage depots filled entire landscapes. These warehouses and bunkers, located on former military bases, airfields, and in some cases hidden in the remote parts of Allied colonies, were now filled with goods of uncertain value. For the British alone, the United States, and the Soviet Union, millions of tons of ammunition required disposal, repurposing, or secure storage. To simply discard such assets was deemed too costly and impractical, but what could be done with them? The immediate response by the Allies was to consider their options. The United States, with its massive surplus of both conventional and chemical munitions, moved quickly to secure these stocks in specially designated storage areas, many of which were in remote parts of the country, such as Utah and Nevada. But the expense of keeping these stockpiles secure, especially in a time of shifting priorities, proved too great. In 1946, the U.S. Army began reviewing options for disposal, though the scale of the task only became evident as inventories grew. The numbers were staggering. An estimated 15 million tons of munitions alone were held in reserve, and the cost of maintaining these stocks was projected to be $1 million per day, an expense that the peacetime economy could not bear. Still, there were also attempts to repurpose the munitions for civilian uses, especially for industrial applications where explosives were required for mining or large-scale construction projects. These ventures were few and far between, and their effectiveness was questionable at best. The overall demand for such services was insufficient to sustain the massive stockpiles, leading to a broader, more practical solution: scrapping. In Europe, the situation was no less urgent. Many of the munitions stored in France, Belgium, and Germany were left in hastily built depots, often in poor conditions. The vast majority of the ammunition was concentrated in northern France, where Allied forces had stored arms for the liberation of the continent. But by 1945, these massive quantities of war material were no longer needed. For the British, the problem was compounded by a dire post-war economy. The demands of war had drained the coffers, and now, surplus ammunition represented not only a material burden but an economic one as well. Scrap metal, which had once been a valuable commodity, now became a source of income and material for rebuilding. In some cases, it was cheaper to scrap the munitions than to store or manage them. Demolition teams were dispatched to begin the arduous task of dismantling these stores, though it was not without danger. The process was slow, and several accidents occurred as workers dismantled large quantities of ordnance that had become unstable due to their age. The British, however, were not entirely willing to discard such valuable materials. After all, they had once been the key to their wartime victories. In some cases, leftover shells were converted into training ammunition, while others were carefully stored for potential future conflicts, though no one knew when that might be. The Soviet Union, too, faced similar challenges in the years following the war. The USSR had accumulated a massive stockpile of munitions, many of which were poorly stored and ill-maintained. Following the end of the conflict in 1945, Soviet military planners quickly recognized the problem posed by these surplus arms. The Soviet approach differed somewhat from that of the West. The USSR, under Joseph Stalin's leadership, faced significant material shortages and would attempt to repurpose munitions for domestic uses, such as fertilizer production, or attempt to covertly dispose of munitions through clandestine methods. But the Soviet system's lack of transparency meant that the scale of the issue was less documented, and the broader global consequences of this surplus would not become fully evident until later decades. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the situation was equally dire. As Allied forces took control of Japanese-controlled territories, they found themselves responsible for the enormous stockpiles of weapons and ammunition left behind. The Japanese, in their final days of resistance, had constructed vast storage bunkers and depots filled with bombs, mines, and small arms. However, with the collapse of the Japanese Empire, these sites became a global concern, particularly for the United States, which sought to ensure that any remaining munitions did not fall into the hands of communist insurgents. Much like in Europe, the cost of securing and maintaining such stockpiles was immense. The solution was similar: scrapping, disposal, and eventual repurposing of materials for civilian use. This was not always a straightforward process. In the years following the war, several accidents involving unexploded ordnance (UXO) were reported in the Pacific, where the remnants of war continued to claim lives. By 1947, the sheer volume of surplus munitions had created a substantial challenge for the Allied powers. The process of disposal was slow, and the situation only worsened as more and more stockpiles were uncovered. The problem became particularly acute in Europe, where the rebuilding of war-torn economies and infrastructures took precedence. The urgency of dismantling old war supplies was secondary to the need for rebuilding industries, securing food supplies, and restoring basic services. A conflict over the fate of these munitions played out behind closed doors, where officials weighed the potential danger of leftover bombs against the potential economic value of scrap metal. Yet, the larger question remained unanswered: what to do with a war machine that no longer needed to be fed? At the beginning of 1948, British officials began to implement stricter policies on the disposal of munitions. Contracts were awarded to firms specializing in scrap metal recovery and disposal, though progress was still slow. As stocks were dismantled and repurposed, large quantities of ammunition simply disappeared into the landscape, abandoned, forgotten, or rendered unusable. It was, in many ways, a silent and invisible loss of materials, of value, and of history. The effects of this loss, however, would be felt for years to come, as the world's war machinery slowly transformed from an active force to a distant memory. By 1948, as the immediate post-war recovery began to take shape, the problem of surplus ammunition reached a new level of urgency. With the world's major powers shifting from wartime economies to peacetime priorities, the question of what to do with the vast stockpiles of unused ordnance took on even greater significance. These stockpiles were no longer merely a logistical problem. They had become symbols of the war itself, relics of a conflict that had devastated much of Europe and the Pacific. And yet, as the global landscape evolved, the stockpiles, for all their material value, seemed increasingly irrelevant to the needs of peacetime economies. The threat of war may have receded, but the ammunition still had to go somewhere. The United States, which had played a pivotal role in the Allied war effort, faced its own set of challenges. The scale of the country's surplus munitions was staggering. It is estimated that by the time the war ended, the U.S. had more than 17 million tons of ammunition in its stockpiles. Much of this was stored in remote areas of the country, places like the Nevada desert or Utah's Tooele Army Depot. These depots, which had once been critical to the war effort, now became a logistical nightmare for military planners. Keeping these stockpiles secure, especially in the face of a rapidly changing world, was a costly proposition. The military estimated that maintaining these depots could cost upwards of $1 million per day, a sum that was unsustainable for a country struggling to transition back into a peacetime economy. The solution, however, was not as simple as scrapping the munitions. Despite the fact that the war was over, the sheer volume of materials in these depots meant that any disposal effort had to be done carefully and in stages. Many of the weapons were old and outdated, but some, particularly artillery shells and small arms ammunition, were still functional. This raised the question of whether these materials could be put to any use in the civilian sphere or whether they could be sold or exported to countries that still faced conflict or unrest. For the U.S., the answer came in the form of the War Assets Administration, WAA, which was tasked with overseeing the disposal of surplus wartime materials. The WAA began to auction off large amounts of ammunition, both domestically and internationally. However, this process was slow and met with limited success. Most of the ammunition was simply too much of a surplus to be useful, and even if it could be sold, the profits were minimal compared to the overall costs of managing the stockpiles. As a result, the WAA began to focus on large-scale disposal methods. In many cases, the stockpiles were sold to contractors who dismantled the ordnance, often by cutting it down and converting it into scrap metal. Other times, entire depots of ammunition were simply incinerated or detonated in controlled explosions. The problem of surplus ammunition was also felt in Europe, where the situation was even more complex due to the destruction wrought by the war. In countries like France, Belgium, and Germany, vast quantities of ordnance remained in the hands of the Allies. However, in the immediate post-war period, many of these countries were struggling with the effects of the war. The rebuilding of infrastructure and economies took precedence, and dealing with the leftover ammunition became a secondary concern. The British, for example, struggled with an economy shattered by the war. With a debt that reached billions of pounds, the costs of maintaining large stockpiles of surplus ordnance were unaffordable. As a result, they began to implement disposal programs, which often involved the mass destruction of unwanted munitions. The process of scrapping munitions was not without danger. In many cases, the materials had become unstable over time, especially the explosives contained within bombs and shells. In Britain, as well as in France and Germany, the disposal teams faced numerous challenges, including the risk of accidental detonation. These risks were particularly high when it came to artillery shells and landmines, which were prone to corrosion and deterioration. In some cases, workers were killed or injured during disposal operations. Yet, for the most part, the mass destruction of munitions was considered necessary. The potential cost of storing them indefinitely, or the risk of their accidental use in future conflicts, outweighed the dangers of scrapping them. Some of the ammunition, however, was not discarded so hastily. A portion of the surplus was repurposed for civilian use. In the early years after the war, there was some demand for explosives in industries like mining and construction. In countries like Britain, where rebuilding efforts required vast amounts of raw materials, some munitions were converted into industrial explosives. These explosives, while still potent, were seen as an economical solution to the shortage of materials. In some cases, artillery shells were used as a source of raw materials, with the metal casings being melted down and recycled for other purposes. In the Soviet Union, the situation was different but equally dire. The USSR had amassed an enormous stockpile of munitions during the war, and the cost of managing and disposing of these materials was a significant burden on the Soviet economy. However, in contrast to the Western Allies, the Soviet government took a more secretive approach to the disposal process. Much of the ammunition was stored in remote locations throughout the vast Soviet Union, far from the prying eyes of foreign observers. In the years following the war, Soviet officials sought ways to quietly dispose of the ordnance, often by burying it in secluded areas or burning it in large-scale operations that were kept under wraps. This method of disposal, while effective in terms of getting rid of the materials, meant that little was documented about the exact scope of the problem. Yet even with these efforts to dispose of the surplus, much of the ammunition remained, quietly deteriorating in hidden locations. While the Soviet Union continued to develop new weaponry throughout the Cold War, the legacy of these leftover munitions would come to haunt the Soviet government decades later. The stockpiles, though no longer needed, would remain a reminder of the war that had shaped so much of the 20th century. In fact, Many of the weapons and ammunition discarded in the post-war years would later emerge as a source of danger in regions still embroiled in conflict, with leftover ordnance causing numerous civilian casualties long after it was deemed obsolete by the original powers that created it. In the Pacific, the problem was no less complicated. The United States, having defeated the Japanese Empire, found itself responsible for securing vast quantities of ordnance left behind in the Pacific Islands. These stockpiles were not only a logistical problem but also a potential threat. Much of the munitions were stored in underground bunkers or hidden in dense jungle areas. As American forces took control of these territories, the task of securing and disposing of the leftover ordnance became an important priority. However, the conditions of many of the sites were poor, and the ordnance was often unstable. Over the years, numerous accidents were reported, particularly in the years following the war, as local populations unaware of the dangers would unwittingly stumble upon leftover bombs or mines. The threat from these munitions would continue to affect the Pacific region for decades, with recovery efforts still ongoing in some areas into the 21st century. By the early 1950s, the urgency of dealing with the surplus ammunition had waned somewhat. The global focus had shifted to the Cold War, and many of the stockpiles that remained were quietly forgotten, buried in remote areas or converted into raw materials. Yet, the implications of these actions would be felt for years to come. For the Allied powers, the process of dealing with the vast quantities of wartime munitions was a necessary but ultimately unsatisfactory conclusion to the war effort. While the weapons themselves had been rendered obsolete, the economic and environmental costs of their disposal would reverberate long after the final shell was destroyed.